All right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Fall BookFest 2021. Our panel today is the Fantasist Forge and the Mythologist Muse, and our general topic is going to be discussing fantasy novels, fantasy short stories, and where these things come from, why we love them, and we're just going to dig into what makes these things tick. So first, we're going to have everyone introduce themselves so we know who we're speaking to. So just very quickly, my name is Neil Halford. I will be the moderator for this panel. I'm a writer. I'm a game designer. And also the showrunner for an audio drama series called Uncharted Regions, which is probably my prime stake of being on this particular panel, because all things weird and fantasy and mythology all sort of intersect with what's going on with me. So we're going to move down here to Laurel.
I'm Laurel Anne Hill, author and former underground storage tank operator. I'm the author of about over 35 published short stories, a whole bunch of published short nonfiction, and 3 novels that fall into the realm of fantasy.
Wonderful. Leslie?
Hello, I'm Leslie Ann Moore. I am an author. I'm the former vice president of the Greater Los Angeles Writers Society. I have 4 published novels to date, all of which fall into the realm of fantasy or science fantasy. I'm also a practicing veterinarian, a cosplayer, and a belly dancer.
Cool. Alana, how about you?
Hi, I'm Alana C. Meyer. I'm the author of The Harp and Ring Sequence, which is a fantasy trilogy from Tor Books. The first novel in the trilogy is called Last Song Before Night. I've also written a lot of book reviews and essays, and I used to be a journalist in Jerusalem many years ago.
Cool. And Mike?
My name is Mike Robinson. I'm a speculative fiction author. I like to explore all interstitial realms of the dark and the strange and the weird. I published 10 novels, over 20 short stories, and I'm also a freelance book editor and manuscript consultant. But I under editing, I do every genre, but my wheelhouse, obviously, and my forte is speculative fiction, dark fantasy, contemporary fantasy, in particular.
Well, that's great, because I think that honestly, you really do need someone who understands the genres and sort of understands what the tropes are and how these things work or whatever. So it's really good to have all that under your belt and to understand those things when you're editing these texts. So I'm going to just go ahead and dive right into this. And I want to talk about science fiction and fantasy, speculative fiction in general. And frequently, these are vehicles for commenting on social or world issues. And so is that something that each of you consciously do when you're working on your writing, or do you shy away from that? And if you do kind of dip into allegory, what do you think has been the theme that you deal with most frequently in your work, if you are doing kind of allegorical kind of stuff in your work?
Well, I can chime in on that.
Sure.
I definitely will put social issues into my stories if it is important to the storyline, if it fits. I don't just throw stuff in to have it there. It's got to mesh with the story. And I've certainly done that on my latest novel, Plague of Flies, which I've set during the Bear Flag Rebellion in California, where the people from the United States invaded Mexican California and wanted to claim a substantial amount of Mexican land for themselves.
I also, in all of my work, I'm very, I always put in some sort of social justice issue. So, for instance, in my award-winning Griffin's Daughter trilogy, I dealt with racism. I also dealt with classism and sexism in a fantasy world. In my latest book, Skein of Fates, which is the first book of the New Tierra Chronicles, It's set on a planet, New Tierra, which means New Earth in Spanish. The colonial civilization came from Old Earth, and they were fleeing climate change. And then I also deal with issues of racism in that book as well.
Okay. Alana or Mike, do you want to dive into that?
Okay. I would say, my first thought when I heard your question is that, in my view, when we write fantasy, even if our world looks completely different from our world, even if the fantasy world we've created looks completely different, there's no way to write anything without writing from within our own concerns and within our own time and dealing with the issues that are most important to us. And I think fantasy is actually a really powerful tool for doing that. And that's why I love writing fantasy, because I feel like in a way we get to engage with the issues that are most important to us using all kinds of creative tools that we don't have necessarily in a more realistic genre.
Sort of springboard off of that, there's no way to escape the time that you're writing in. So we're all going to be, whether consciously or not, kind of reflecting the times. I generally try to refrain from topical issues. I like, and this sounds arrogant to say, but I like to address more timeless matters, big questions, meaning of life, God, consciousness, metaphysics, quantum physics, that kind of stuff, to the extent that I can, my layman brain can understand it, at least the theories behind it. So I like to do things that aren't going to, which is not to say that, a lot of these issues that we've been talking about are, longstanding and will continue to be issues in the foreseeable future, unfortunately, particularly, just as we become more tribal and the environment issues are at hand. And so I'm sure those things have seeped into my work, and they definitely have, but I try to keep things broad. I try to address things that are binding for all of humankind and that are matters of concern and that are giant questions before all of us.
I think that it's definitely been there for a very long time. It's, it's kind of surprising that some people are kind of popping out of the work and saying, oh, well, we're talking about this issue or that issue. And, when did all this kind of creep in? And I said, it's, if you go back and you look at all of the sort of fantasy fiction, I think it's always been there. And I just think that is that in some ways people are becoming more aware of it, because I think the nature of our genre has changed. Whenever I was a little kid, we were very definitely kind of in a little pocket. Only people who read fantasy or science fiction were our own weird little tribe of people who read it. And we've seen that stuff go mainstream. So it's not that the genre has changed. I think it's because the readership is wider and they're just not all used to this idea that we're going to tackle these kinds of subjects out there. So I don't really think it's a new thing, at least in my particular opinion or my experience. So I want to hop into talking about dreams and visions and prophecies, and they're frequently used as in mythological works. And it says, how does prophecy tend to work within the context of your stories, or the use of visions? Do you approach them like they are absolute visions of truth, or are these things where someone is using a prophecy to manipulate, other cultures or other people? And did you ever have a situation where you came up with a prophecy that sounded really cool, so you dropped it into your story without knowing where that prophecy was going to go? And so in what ways have these prophecies, visions and dreams sort of affected your work or shown up in your work?
Well, I love dreams and visions and prophecies, and not just because they're there to foretell something, but to be misunderstood, so that your protagonist goes off in another direction thinking, I'm going to do this, and whoops, interpreted that one wrong. And so it can actually create just a wonderful story situation where the character doesn't know which way he or she is going, and I just love it.
Yeah, I agree with you totally, Laurel Anne, because I also like to have use prophecy or vision as a way to, if not confuse the character that is the subject of the prophecy, but to send them on a path that ends up not being the ultimate path that they go on. So it does lead to very interesting storytelling that way.
Yeah. Well, that's actually that's the original prophecy that we have from Greek mythology. I wish I could remember the story, but it's in Herodotus. It's this rich man, was it Croesus? He asks Oracle of Delphi if he should go to war. And they say, they give him this cryptic reply that he thinks means that, yes, he should. And then, of course, what really happened was, it was a very bad idea. And the hint was right there in the prophecy all along. And I think that depiction of prophecy is the one that is really the most elemental that we have. And it's affected how we use it now. I definitely love playing with that. I think prophecies should be mysterious, because I think the essence of magic and enchantment is mystery. It's connected to mysteries, just the way in real life, there's so much that we feel we can't comprehend. That's something I like, using magic and enchantments in order to explore those things in life that mystify us. And so that's why I always see prophecy as something that should be unknowable, and we may think we understand it. And then, of course, because we are just human, we are prone to misinterpreting it.
Yeah, I mean, one of my pet passions is the messy title overlap between mind and matter. And so I have been known to use a lot of dreams and visions. I don't know. It depends on how you maybe define prophecy. I'm not really directly used prophecy in my stories, I wouldn't say. I mean, there's foreshadowing, and there's definitely dreams that foreshadow, and characters that, relate a strange anecdote or something that might pay off later. I don't know if that could be classified as prophecy to a certain degree, or subspecies of it. But yeah, I love playing in that realm. That is really, just basically the inner universe dwarfs the outer universe. That's sort of what I like to the playground I like to play in.
Yeah, and of course, so destiny obviously intertwines with that notion. Is the notion of, do I have a destiny, and who determines what that destiny is? And so that's always the great theme about, am I fated to do this, or does destiny belong to whatever I decide destiny is going to be? And so that's sort of the how the protagonist reacts to this. Is the moment that I hear the prophecy, is that now what's going to be happen, simply because either because of the way I react against it, or because so I'm reacting against it makes the prophecy happen, which the Greeks love that. They just love to say, I'm going to throw you a prophecy and now you're screwed, because once you hear the prophecy, you're going down that path and there's nothing you can do to stop that. And so I've always loved that thing, because and also to add a more practical thing is that every person, every character to some degree deals with the notion of destiny, because you don't have an oracle standing next to you and saying you were fated to do this, but you do have parents who have expectations about what you're going to be in your life, and you have friends, and you have the cultural expectations about who you are and how you should slot into those ideas. And so I actually think is that without even a necessarily mystical aspect to it, it is something that is true in all genres of writing, is the fact that we deal with the expectations of what what we're meant to be by others, and how we react to or against that.
I came up with a really cool. Oh, am I interrupting?
No. Oh no, I just said that was very true. Yeah, absolutely.
I came up with a real cool prophecy, and that for my latest book, the Plague of Flies book, and that was that a spirit man riding a black Andalusian stallion would carry the protagonist, my heroine, away. She's 16. And so what this has done for her at the opening of the book is that it has ruined her chances of marrying the young man she loves, because his father disapproves of her, thinking she must be a terribly unchaste woman if this prophecy has been made about her. And so she's all befuddled over that. And then, of course, when the spirit man came along, I said, now what do I do? And I had to really put on that old thinking cap to come up with something that was going to work for the story. And I did.
Mm-hmm.
I did. I was really pleased with myself, but it really took me by surprise.
Well, I really love that, because it was something where you had to, it became a storytelling problem, and so is that, okay, I threw this out to myself, and so now it's almost like a prompt for, okay, what do I do with this now? So I love that. That's wonderful. So I want to Alana already kind of touched on this a little bit. I want to talk about magic. And so a lot of times whenever I've had discussions about fantasy novels, we kind of get into the ditch about magic systems, but I want to kind of flip it over a little bit and discuss. It says that often whenever we see magic in a fantasy universe, it's always from the standpoint of the person who's trying to become the wizard, or someone who is, they're becoming a caster, or they're experienced. But I kind of like to know how in your universes, how do the ordinary people in the world interact with magic? Is it something that is a positive force in their lives? They say, wow, I'd really love to know how to use magic, and this is sort of an aspirational sort of thing. Or is it like, okay, let's burn all of the witches? Is it something that's in their everyday lives? And so how do each of you kind of approach magic in the texture of everyday life?
Oh, that's a good question.
I think magic and mythology and stuff kind of intertwines together. And if you look at all of the world's major religions, I mean, there is myth and magic built into them that has been told over and over and over and over again. And from stories that evolved so long ago that people believed this sort of thing, and that it was never questioned that this, that a donkey could talk, or this could happen, or that could happen. And so they become one of the foundations of the many, many different stories. And I'm a Methodist. And so, and I recognize all this. And when I do my religion, I have to put all the rest of my brain aside, because, I have certain beliefs, and that's the way it is. But when I write, I think it's just wonderful to have this, because you can have a character in a dilemma. My character, Catalina Delgado, she is a Catholic. What do the priests and the Franciscan padres and all that teach? Witchcraft, burn at the stake. Your soul will go to hell, all these other things. So she comes along and she finds out she's a mestiza. And the woman she thought was her real mother, isn't. And so now she finds herself in a position where she's going to have to enlist the help of Coyote in order to help protect the people she loves. And so now what's going to happen to her? How can she redeem herself afterwards? Or is Coyote actually a saint that the padres won't tell people about? So I can use, looking at my own religion, use magic and myth, and I can do that for others too, but I do it best with my own. Or if I totally make one up, then I can make anything else I want. But when, you have to be careful.
In my latest New Tierra trilogy, there is no magic. But in the Griffin's Daughter trilogy, there is magic amongst humans do not have magic, but elves do have magic. All elves have a certain level of magic, but it varies greatly from individual to individual, and it is fading as time goes by. But the average person can use small magics, and they just consider it just an ordinary part of life. They might be able to conjure fire, or they might be able to speak mind to mind with other individuals. But in order to do great magic that requires, or magic that manipulates energy and matter, you have to have a certain level of talent. They call it talent, and you have to go to mage school to be trained. So the ordinary person, if you don't have a necessary level of talent, you can't become a mage. And in the human realm, the humans consider magic to be evil. And they also consider elves to have no souls. And so partly because they wield magic. And their religion tells them that they must kill any magic wielders amongst them. So it's very much burn the witch, that sort of thing. So the average person, even if they did have a little magic, would have to hide it. But closest that I have to magic in the New Tierra series is prophecy and foresight. But that's debatable whether you call that magic.
Well, if you get it right, it's pretty darn good.
Yeah. Yeah.
How about Alana or Mike? You got any thoughts on that?
So I'll just chime in real quick. With my own
Sure.
stuff, I don't really use magic per se. I guess the closest corollary would be untapped potential. So my stuff is more contemporary fantasy, I guess urban fantasy, you could describe it as such. People who take a larger bite of consciousness than they can chew. People who are psychically sensitive, who can see elementals or other strange phenomena. And so, yeah, when people ask me, what's your magic system? I'm like, well, I don't really write in that avenue of fantasy necessarily. I mean, what's reality's magic system? We don't know what that is. Reality is strange. It's forever beyond our grasp. So, and that's what I kind of like to explore. I mean, to me, the magic is the unknown.
I tend to agree with you, even though I write, fantasy. I think, I personally have avoided having a magic system for the same reason that you expressed, that just as we don't fully comprehend our reality, I picture magic as something that embodies what we don't fully comprehend
Right.
in a fantasy world. In the world of my trilogy, there's various countries that have different magical traditions. In the part of the world where most of the trilogy takes place, there isn't magic, but there once was, and a large theme of the trilogy is the consequences when that magic begins to break through again, because it's actually pretty terrifying and dangerous. In the more Middle Eastern inspired part of the world where some of the trilogy is set, magic is a completely different kind of force, in the sense that it's wielded by court magicians, and the general public are not allowed to have anything to do with it on pain of death. They're not even allowed to buy books or manuscripts that might give them access to magical knowledge. It's something that's entirely reserved for a tiny elite to wield. And they probably do have a system, actually, because I've envisioned that as a very different kind of magic involving astronomy and different levels to the universe that are part of their belief system.
Yeah. So for, of course, my experience is that, my day job for many, many years has been working in the computer gaming industry. And so systems are all about what everything that goes on. So I actually kind of enjoy whenever I'm doing my own stuff is kind of pulling back and not having quite so much stuff that's based on very intricate mechanics about stuff because I like the idea that it's a little bit mystical and it's not exactly an exact science, and I think that's the danger too, is that I think the temptation is to make it very, very logical in the way that it works. And obviously there is some thought about, well, if people use magic, there has to be some sort of logical structure to it, or you'd never be able to work magic.
I mean, to me, that almost dulls the reality of the term magic.
Yes.
if you can put it in a lab and put it in a test tube, or just have these mechanics behind it. I don't know. It doesn't seem like magic to me. There has to be that X quotient.
Yeah, it turns into Clark's science,
right. Right.
But anyway, magic is obviously a lot of fun. It's the reason why why we love reading fantasy versus other kinds of things, is because we want that thing is that it's a little bit unattainable. It's a little bit beyond our able to really completely grasp it. And so I think that's, in my personal opinion, I like magic that feels a little more loose and we don't explain everything. Campbell always says if you explain too much, you lose your story. And so that's one case where I definitely kind of agree with that approach to things.
I think that adds some suspense to it too.
Yeah.
When
exactly.
the practitioners don't know exactly the full extent of what they're dealing with or what they're wielding, so they could wreak terrible havoc. Anyway, that was just a postscript, but I completely agree.
I love the blend of magic and magical realism too. So kind of woven together so that you don't know really quite what's going on, but you do.
So I actually like, I've hear people, talk about magical realism, and what's your definition of magical realism? Because I've heard people give different definitions for it. So I'm just kind of curious how you would define it yourself.
Isabel Allende.
Okay.
She wrote I don't know if you ever read Zorro, the novel, but it was, there's really not much in the way of magic going on there, but things that are happening are very magical. And the people that are happening to it believe it because that's the type of thing they believe in their culture. And so, so I think that's the best way to explain it. It's closer to being real than it is to magic, but the people believe in this magic and it is as if it's happening.
I think for me, it's
Water for Chocolate is another one. Excellent.
Right. Yeah. I think for me, it's a kind of like what Laurel said. It's sort of a quote unquote magical story where the characters aren't really phased or reacting to the magic. It's just kind of woven into everyday life.
Yes.
And
so that's exactly it. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you, Mike. That's how I think of it is it's just everyday life, but oh gosh, somebody just flew by me. Oh well,
right.
Yeah. That somebody just materialized in my living room. Oh, okay, right. Ordinary life.
Right.
Right.
Salman Rushdie is another magical realist, especially his last one. Yeah.
Which was that?
I think it was called Quixote. It was a Don Quixote set in Trump's America.
Huh.
It's pretty good. Yeah.
Oh, good to know.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I'm going to talk about mythical creatures here just a little bit. And so they're in fantasy fiction. There are tons of dragons or pegasi or, on sort of the more dark fantasy kind of stuff. You got vampires and werewolves and they get all the press. But what other creatures would you like to see showcased more, or that you like to use in your stuff, or have other authors use more? And also, what's been the most egregious misuse or misunderstanding of mythological creatures that you have seen?
Well, I love centaurs. They are like my favorite. I don't know why, but I just love centaurs. I collect them, and I have a really cool centaur character in the Griffin's Daughter trilogy. Those are my favorite. I love them.
I love things that are done with horses because I've always loved horses. When I was a little girl, I lived in San Francisco. The only horse I ever saw was one pulling a junk wagon. And so, I wanted to train horses, or I wanted to ride horses. And so I write about horses. I learned a lot about horses when I was a child because I loved them so much. And so I tend to take real horses and real animals and make them in some way magical rather than creating a new animal. And so I've got, in one book, I have, the horses that are possessed by the spirits of someone's, ancestors, so that they'll obey when they're supposed to and not get frightened when they hear a gunshot or something like that. In another book I have, or a story, I have a condor, essentially a buzzard, a vulture that is a spirit friend. And so I just love the idea of taking things that are here in the natural world and making them special.
I like that.
I can't really think of a gross misuse of a mythological character at the moment, but I do, in my own work and in the work that I love to read, I tend to appreciate, and it kind of gets back to what I was saying about magic, things that are ill-defined. So if, I never really write about vampires, I never really write about dragons or werewolves. I might write about a reality in which things exist that inspired those things, and there's always sort of this disparity between, what the reality is and what the folklore derived from that reality winds up being. And, as it gets distorted by time and tongue and things like that. So that's fascinating to me. And a really good example of that is Little Big by John Crowley, where
I love that book.
all the fae are kind of like out of the corner of your eye, and they're sort of like, you're not quite sure. I mean, he mentions an elf once, but they're all sort of this vague mystical quality that you're like, oh, and it's not really about the fae too. It's about the family that interacts with them. And so that's definitely kind of my, up my alley.
Yeah. I love Crowley's books. I read them when I was a kid, and just magical, wonderful stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Alana? Oh, sorry.
I was originally. Oh, sorry, Leslie. Don't let me cut you
You
off.
go on, Alana. Go on.
Oh, well, first I was just going to say that I was initially just going to cede the floor because I'm pretty focused on humans. But then when Mike mentioned the Fae, I was like, oh, actually, the Fae are really interesting to me too. I tend to think that the scarier they are, the better, the more effective it is. So I did think of that. So thanks for that idea. Anyway, that's all I had to say about that.
Oh, I have something to add to that. It just made me think of Graham Joyce's The Tooth Fairy. Has anybody read that? That is,
No,
I've never read that.
It's great.
It is a wonderful, wonderful story. And
Yeah, it rings a bell.
I've read everything that man wrote.
I've heard he was really great.
Yeah.
So what made you think of that?
Well, something you'd said about Faye. I thought of the Tooth Fairy.
The fairy in the tooth?
Yeah, is it a scary, malevolent tooth fairy or a?
Yeah, but you never know when it's scary and when it's not.
Wait, so you can't pacify it with a dime? or a quarter or something.
Are there dentist metaphors? Because that would be really terrifying.
Well, I actually have kind of enjoyed is the fact that we're kind of winding back the Fae back to what they were before they became sort of sanitized, because the old versions of the Fae are terrifying, is that you don't want to go with the beautiful maiden off to her special magic land. That's not something you want to do. And so it's only in the age of Tolkien where we've said, okay, well, we're going to go off to these magical lands, and these will be wonderful kind of places. And said, I like scary elves, because they're not human. Right. They don't think the way we do.
That's true. Yeah, you thought of Tolkien, which is totally valid. I was thinking of Disney. We passed through sort of a Disney-fied membrane in our culture generally. I mean, that's reductive, but there's many other factors, but yeah.
Well, they were, they were the archetypes of nightmares, in the Middle Ages and everything. Trolls and fairies and all that other stuff. They're going to take you away and do terrible things to you. And so I kind of like seeing a return to that to some respects. And so, of course, I suppose the danger is that's a bit xenophobic. But I think that I
don't think so. I mean, there's a lot of human jerks, and there's probably a lot of elemental jerks.
So I want to talk to you about your process in regards to building your worlds and everything else. And so whenever you're working on your stuff, are you meticulous and do you hammer out every single little detail about your people, or are you more exploratory? And then also I just want to throw in sort of add on is that in the course of your writing, have you ever experienced an instance where you introduced a new bit of world building or lore that you realized completely broke everything else in the universe? And you had to go back and fix everything else. And so, if so, what was the Pandora's box that you opened?
World building. I wouldn't say a meticulous world builder. I don't hammer out every single detail like some writers I know who just have volumes and volumes of detail about their world, and then they never get around to writing the book. But for things that are going to be germane to the story, then I will work out details. So I tend to I'll work out like for the New Tierra Chronicles, I worked out monetary system, and I worked out transportation and food production and some things like that. But I don't know every single detail about this world yet. I'm trying to build a religion, and I have some details, but since the characters it's not germane to the story yet, I haven't worked out all those details. But it's coming. I have notes, but I don't want to fall into that trap where I just do nothing but world building, and then the story never gets written. And as for your other question, I can't think of anything that I came up with that broke the system and I had to go back and fix it. It may still happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, I've got one particular story. My first novel started out as a short story. And in fact, 2 of my 3 novels started out as a short story. And this particular one was in a different world, same atmosphere, blue sky, because I wanted to have a mixture of the aliens and the humans. And the aliens are the stronger of the 2 races. They're the Krens are 8 feet tall. The guys, they've got 4 arms. The guys have claws on their hands. They've got lizard-like scales on their skin and photosynthetic head scales, so that they don't have to, so that they can, find nourishment in a very hot, dry, deserty place.
I love that book, by the way.
Oh, did you read it?
Yes, I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
Oh, golly, thank you. I I put that together, and it didn't work as a short story. But I converted it into a novel because the publisher of a small press, Kominar, needed another book in a hurry because somebody had backed out. They hadn't come up with the book, and she needed another book. And she said, "Laurel, can you write this?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, okay, I'll do it." She said, "You got 6 weeks." And I go, "Oh, shit," because, excuse me. But I was working full time, and sometimes 8-10 hours a day. So that was quite a thing. But with that, I had to change something. Something changed, that it did not work the way I had 2 characters. And my publisher says, "You've got to make those 2 characters one character, because this is too short of a novel. It's not going to work." And I thought, how am I going to do this? And I did it, but it took going back to the beginning. And so, and just going through and then weaving in the story again, so that this was only going to be one character. And it came out all right, but I certainly didn't expect it.
It came out more than all right. It's a beautiful book, Laurel. I loved it.
Oh, that
really
makes
did.
me feel so happy.
How about you, Alana?
I just first want to say that was such a beautiful moment that you don't get to see very often on a panel.
Yeah.
So when I started my book, I knew which historical and mythological elements I wanted. I was really inspired by the Celtic poets, because I was in college. I didn't know what I was getting into. I took this course in the Celtic poets, and the professor was talking about how these poets had a lot of power in their society, or so the myth goes. And I was like, wow, a society where poets have power? First of all, that sounds, totally crazy in our world, but also it sounded like a great opportunity for me to explore my own feelings about art. Especially, when I was 23, it seemed like a good idea. I didn't know it was going to take 10 years to write this book, or I don't know. So what I did was I read as much as I could about that, but I also wanted to incorporate the troubadours, medieval France. And so I just read everything I could about, that setting. And around that time in my life, I went to a panel at the 92nd Street Y with David Milch, the creator of Deadwood. And he was talking about his own process. He said that he told his writers in his writer's room, to, read all this, research and then forget it. And he didn't really mean forget it, but I kind of understood what he meant. You kind of you absorb it into your bones, but you don't have to get obsessed with every little detail. So I thought I really took that as a guidance. I read as much as I could, and then I was like, okay, I've, absorbed what I can. Thank God it's not historical fiction, so I don't have to be, I don't have to be accurate to something that exists already. And that was the spirit in which I created the world of the first novel. And that tends to be how I work generally. It's fun with fantasy because you don't have to worry about getting something wrong. It's as long as it works in your world, it works.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah. So for me, it's kind of a constant braiding of story and world building. So I have to. So obviously I have the idea, and I let it kind of gestate in my brain for a while, and then I have to start the story in order to feed the rest of it. It has to be a thing in order to inform the rest of the world. I can't just sit there and make decimal points about the particulars of the world. That's just not how my brain works. I'm not judging that. But yeah, like Leslie said, you can easily get mired in doing that. So, and I like to have a story that's flowing, something that I can relate all that world building to. So it's a constant braiding. As far as something that I had to go back and revise, I wouldn't say I've ever kind of broken a story or a world, but I definitely have made a world way too complex. and I'm just like, okay, because I'm trying to, in a weird way, I'm trying to reflect the complexity of, I guess, the world, or what I perceive to be, the metaphysical world. And I'm like, okay, no, priority number one, make this a digestible and entertaining story. Don't just, go off into James Joyce territory. So like, yeah, I have to scale all that back. But yeah, that would be my answer to that.
I kind of totally understand all that kind of stuff. And it kind of going back to what I said before is working in games. I unfortunately have to create huge encyclopedias of stuff because this informs the gameplay. It informs how the art is done and all this other stuff. And so that is my default mode, is to create this huge, gigantic encyclopedia of stuff. But the danger becomes is, am I ever going to get started? Right. Because I'm still in that habit of I've got to create all this stuff so I understand how all the stuff hooks together. So I think that we've only got really time for one more question for us to kind of dive into here. This is talking about your readers and talking about interacting with the people who read your stuff. And so sometimes a reader will come up and comment about something you've written and point out things in your work that either you didn't consciously put there, or they'll spot something you thought no one else was ever going to pick out or figure out that you put in there. And so what is the most interesting insight that a reader has talked to you about, something they brought to you and talked about, or the most unexpected reaction that somebody had to something that was in one of your books?
Well, I think that, and I'm not sure if this was one of my books or one of my short stories.
That's fine.
Because there was a conflict in there where one person had gotten really angry at another person and was, just was not going to speak to them. And it brought up terrible consequences that happened. I can't even remember the story it was, but I remember this woman coming up to me and she said, I read your story and I had fought with a woman last week and I just called her up and apologized and asked her to forgive me.
That's really sweet.
You did. You just never know how your work is going to affect someone. And it's always a surprise to me.
I think the most interesting thing that a reader's ever said to me, it wasn't something that he had picked out of the story, but and it was actually through email. It wasn't direct face-to-face, but I got an email from a gentleman who was an older gentleman, and he'd read my Griffin's Daughter books, which, while not YA, although there is a YA version, but it wasn't specifically YA. I didn't really expect a lot of men, particularly older men, to read it. But this email said, because I just wanted to, and I'm paraphrasing, I just want to thank you. You made this old Vietnam vet cry from your story. And he said, it's just, I was so moved by it that, if you can make this old Vietnam vet cry, then, you've really done something. And I just treasured that email. It was just really special. And I just remember running around screaming, oh my God, this man, he's a Vietnam vet. So he must be, in his 60s or 70s. And he cried over Griffin's Daughter. And it really touched me. So that's like the nicest thing I think anyone said about any of my stories.
Alana?
Well, I hope I'll have more stories like this as time goes on, because my books haven't been out very long. But I can think of one instance where someone picked up on something that, I didn't think anyone would notice. One of my characters in my first novel starts out a very girly girl, and then things happen to her. as they will do when you don't know what you're doing in life. And someone was interviewing me for my third book, actually, talking about the evolution of this character. And she's like, I thought of Sansa from Game of Thrones. It seemed to me that you had issues with how George Martin treated Sansa, and you were, kind of commenting on it in this book, but maybe you weren't doing that on purpose. And I was like, I absolutely was. She was a little taken aback. I was like, yes, that was not an accident. Because back when I was writing the book, George Martin's series was very influential on fantasy writers. It was like 2004 or something. It was before the show. And we were all in different ways responding to that elephant in the room.
Mike?
So yeah, that's happened is at the forefront of my mind twice. Once with my novel Dreamshores, a reader told me that she thought of it as the kind of the conflict between the an artist's material, like how much of an artist's material belongs to them versus the public, and the legacy of an artist and how much that can be, how much is out of the hands of a given artist. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. That's totally true that was there, but it was very, not consciously there. I had other things operating on my hardware that I was going for. But that's completely valid. I'm very liberal when it comes to interpretations of my stuff or how people read into it, unless they read into something that's,
sure,
it's a very negative thing. But then another book, Negative Space, someone told me that, yeah, I see this as the, as like almost like an allegory, which I don't really write allegories, but like an allegory between the allegory of the constant flux between organized religion and paganism or whatever, something like that. And so that was another resounding theme and interpretation that I hadn't really considered, which I thought that was interesting. But that particular reader is a friend of mine, and he's like an academic, and he's very much into hermeneutics and
right.
Yeah. Right.
So my claim to fame is actually the same as Leslie. I made a bunch of 14-year-olds cry, including possibly one member of our panel.
I was 15, but okay.
Nice.
But anyway, so we're coming up against our time limit here. So really quickly, if each of you could just tell us where we find you and your works online.
LaurelAnneHill.com. I'll be there. My books are available on Amazon or through any bookstore that carries, buys their stuff from Ingram. And this is the cover of Plague of Flies.
Cool.
Cool. Leslie?
You can find me at leslieannmore.com. You can also find me on the Twitters. You can find me on the Facebooks. You can find me on the Instagrams. All my books are available through Amazon. The Griffin's Daughter trilogy is also available through other booksellers as well, Barnes & Noble, Smashwords. And the latest book is Skein of Fates, and it's available on Amazon. Also, Griffin's Daughter is available as audiobook on Audible.
Cool. Alana?
You can find me at ilanacmeyer.com, though I admit I don't update it that much. This is what my first book looks like. Let me see if I can catch the camera. Like Song Before Night is the first book. I was very lucky with my cover art. Stefan Martiniere did the cover art. You can find the trilogy in most bookstores online. I don't know about physical bookstores these days, but it's possible. Barnes & Noble. And I'm also on Twitter as Ilana CT.
Okay. Mike?
So my website is mike-robinsonauthor.com. You can find, like everyone else said, you can find my stuff on Amazon, on Kobo, on Apple, transcribed Smashwords. So here's just a sampling. Here's the Dreamshores. What are they? And another one that draws from a lot of myth is Prince of Earth, which is a re-release actually. And this is the beginning of a non-linear dark fantasy trilogy, The Green Eyed Monster. That you can read that trilogy in any order, and they kind of fill in each other's cracks.
Okay. Well, and I'm Neil Halford. You can find me everywhere, Facebook, Twitter, or whatever, and also check out our Uncharted Regions audio drama. It has its own website, also on Twitter, also Facebook, whatever. I have to wrap everything up. I just want to thank all of you for being fantastic, wonderful panelists. Thank you for being with us this evening. Really enjoyed speaking with all of you.
Thank you, Neil. That was a great question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Awesome. Bye, guys.